Good afternoon, everyone. Today we have the pleasure to have here with us Professor Alex Edmans. Thanks for being with us today. Professor Alex Edmans is Professor of Finance at the London Business School. He is one of the worldwide top scholars in finance. And today he will present us one of his books. It's 𝐁𝐫𝐸. The book has been published also in an Italian edition, published by Franco Angeli. And it was named as the Financial Times Book of the Year in 2020. Because Alex was one of the first challenging the common wisdom that companies cannot pursue both profit and purpose, while Alex is offering us an innovative view, trying to reconcile doing business for profits and purpose. And this is done relying on a strong and rigorous academic research. So the webinar will be organized as follows. Alex will give his speech. And at the end of the speech, we will collect Q&A, and Alex will reply to Q&A. So in case you want to post a question, please use the Q&A function you will find in the bottom ribbon of a Zoom webinar. So Alex, thanks again for being with us today. The floor is yours.
Great. Thank you very much, Marco. Thank you so much to the University of Padova for hosting me, but thank you in particular for those of you giving up your time to attend and hear my talk. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to present a short summary of my book, 𝐁𝐸𝐸, initially published in English, but then more recently translated into Italian by Franco Angeli. And this is the first Italian event that I'm having. So thanks so much to Marco for hosting this launch. So what this book is about responsible business. So many people think about responsibility as being good for the planet, good for wider society. And that is absolutely true. But at the end of the day, companies also need to be profitable. So both Marco and I are professors in finance, and the reality is that companies are not charities. They need to deliver returns to shareholders. But what I'm going to try and highlight in the book and in my talk is how a sense of purpose, a sense of responsibility can be fully consistent and fully supportive with profit rather than at its expense. So that might seem a bit too good to be true. So let me give an example of what I am thinking about in practice. So I'd like to go back 21 years to 2003. So Vodafone, which is a UK telecoms company, they noticed that in Kenya, people were using their mobile phones to transfer mobile minutes to each other as a form of currency. For example, if I have a plan which gives me 300 minutes per month, and I don't use 100 minutes at the end, I can give them to my friend in return for a sack of grain. And so that was really important because at the time, 15 million Kenyan adults were unbanked. They had to rely on cash, and cash could be forged, it could be lost, it could be stolen. So if Vodafone could pull this off, the social impact would be huge. And indeed, 4 years later, Vodafone successfully launched M-Pesa, which is a mobile money service in Kenya. It allows people to transfer money from phone to phone just as easily as you could send a text message. And notice that this is not mobile banking. So I have bank accounts in the United States because I used to live there. I can operate that on my phone. I don't need to go to the US to do that. But with mobile money, you don't even need a bank account. You could send money just like sending somebody a photo. So this transformed people's lives. So within the first 7 years of launching M-Pesa, this lifted 200,000 households out of poverty. And many of these households are headed up by women. It allowed them to move from agriculture to business and retail, so there was a large effect on gender equality. But the nice coda, the nice finale to this story is, in the end, Vodafone was able to monetize this and turn this into a profit by charging a small percentage of every transaction as a fee. So something which was driven by the idea of creating value for wider society, not to make money, this ultimately made money at the end as a byproduct. So why am I starting my talk with this example is to ask us these two questions. So the first is, how much value did M-Pesa create for society? And the second is, if Vodafone did not launch M-Pesa, what would have been the public outrage or the damage to Vodafone's ESG rating? I'm not going to poll anybody because we will have time for questions and answers at the end. And the reason for not polling anybody is most people agree with the answer. So how much value did M-Pesa create for society? A huge amount of value, right? They lifted 200,000 households out of poverty. It contributed to gender equality. But if I go to the second question, what would have happened if Vodafone did not launch M-Pesa? Nothing, right? There would have been no customer boycott. There would have been no media backlash, because you would never get in trouble for not coming up with this innovation of mobile money, because nobody would expect a telecoms company to do. So why am I opening my talk with this story and these questions? It's to rethink our view as to what it means for a business to be responsible. So often when we think about responsibility, we think about how to answer that second question. We think we should avoid a scandal, we should do no harm. We should not mistreat our workers, we should not cheat on taxes, we should not pollute the environment. And I completely agree with that. Responsible businesses should do no harm. But you knew that before coming on this webinar. You didn't need me to say that businesses should not create harm. Instead, what I want to do today in my talk is to shift our thinking about responsible business to be more about answering the first question: how can we actively create value even if we were not forced to do this? So why is that my view of how a business should think? Well, first, there's the moral and ethical case. Given all the challenges in the world today, climate change, automation, inequality, it is not enough for a business to say, I am doing no harm. It instead needs to actively do good and actively solve these problems rather than just not exacerbating them. But that's a moral and ethical argument. As I mentioned at the start, both Marco and I are finance professors, so we want to focus on the business and financial case. And what is the business and financial case for doing the number two? Well, that is good risk management, right? We don't want our company to avoid a scandal. We want to avoid being in a disaster situation. But if you view responsibility as only being about risk management, you do the minimum possible to avoid a scandal, and you don't go above and beyond. But if you instead view purpose as being about actively creating value, actively growing the pie, well, that is something which can create a huge amount of financial value, because if you create value for society, ultimately society will pay you some of that value. So viewing the responsibility of a firm as not just avoid a scandal, but create value, this can unleash a huge amount of profit and be beneficial to shareholders in the long term. So this is the idea behind my book, Grow the Pie, or Per una torta più grande in the Italian translation. So you often view the value of a company as being given by a pie or a cake. And we think we can split that cake between investors in the form of profits, which is the blue, and society in the form of value, that's the yellow, that could be fair taxes, fair wages, and fair prices. And we often think that a responsible business is one that splits the pie more fairly. We are nice to the environment and our employees. We give them more of the pie, but the problem is that reduces the pie available for investors. So this is why some people don't like responsibility. They don't like sustainability because they believe that it's at the expense of profits. But what I'm highlighting is what a responsible business tries to do is it increases the yellow, not through redistribution, not through giving a greater slice of what's already there, but through growing the pie, through actively creating value, through innovation and excellence. And if you do that, then ultimately the blue will increase as well. If you create value for society, some of that value will accrue to you. So this is why there is such a strong business and financial case for responsibility. It ultimately boosts profits. Now, you might be skeptical, and I would encourage you to be skeptical throughout this talk. You might think, well, if I'm defining responsibility as about innovation, shouldn't any company want to be innovative? For example, let's say your goal was only profit. You only cared about making money as possible. You don't have any purpose. Would you, if you were a car company, would you invest in electric cars? Well, the answer is yes. Even if I don't care about climate change, I will still invest in electric cars because there is money to be made. I could do the net present value calculation that Marco and I teach in our classes, and I will forecast that in the short term, the electric car factory will make losses, but in the long term, it will be profitable. And as long as my spreadsheet is long-term enough and sophisticated enough, the net present value of this electric car factory will be positive. So you don't need a purpose to build electric cars. You only need to be able to do net present value analysis. But what I'm highlighting is there's many decisions that you cannot reduce to a net present value calculation, no matter how good your spreadsheet is. So if I go back to Vodafone and M-Pesa, what is the net present value of developing that? Probably hugely negative. Right? It would have cost a lot of money to develop this. Nobody done it before. And let's say they succeeded. Well, then there's some risk. What if people used it for money laundering? That would be bad for reputation. And even if they managed to stop that, where would the money be to serve some of the poorest people in the world? So at the time, Vodafone had a clear strategy, which was to expand in the West and to win mobile phone license auctions in the UK. So had they just gone after net present value, they would have just focused on the UK and not gone elsewhere. So this is the power of purpose, of a sense of responsibility. We live in a world in which all your competitors know how to do spreadsheet analysis. They know how to make some decisions which will be profitable in the long term. But if you wanted to have a competitive edge, we need to be able to take some decisions that other companies would not be able to take. And are these decisions which we can be basing partly on purpose, on creating value for wider society, not just profit? And so that was the idea of M-Pesa. So Vodafone had a clear purpose. Their purpose at the time was to build a digital society that enhances socio-economic progress, and that, not the profit calculation, was what inspired them to do this. So at this point in my talk, you might think, okay, that sounds a great story. That's even inspirational. A company can serve society and also be profitable. But is this just a hand-picked example? Where is the evidence for what I am claiming? Yes, it would be nice to believe that if you do good for society, good karma will mean that you are paid back in the long term. But how do we know this is not too good to be true? I could have just selected the one company where it happened to work. So this is why I really appreciate Marco's introduction as to what I try to do in my book is to base it on large-scale data and evidence. And indeed, while the most visible part of Marco and my job is teaching, what we spend most of our time doing is research to make sure that what we teach in the classroom is not based on nice stories, but is based on rigorous data. And so what is important is that this data is indeed rigorous because of this problem of confirmation bias, which is people will accept evidence if it confirms what they would like to be true. And so that's a particular problem with responsible business. People would love to believe that ethical companies perform better. So if I show you a study claiming this, you might believe this, even if it's not backed by the data. And indeed, I gave a TED talk a few years ago called What to Trust in a Post-Truth World about how discerning we need to be about evidence, particularly when it's on something we want to be true, because it could be our confirmation bias which is duping us. And indeed, a few months ago, I released a book with Penguin Random House called May Contain Lies on this specific topic. But going back into the task at hand, here's an example of where we could be undone by confirmation bias. So let's take an article in Forbes, a very respected business magazine. So it was describing a study which said companies that excel in their sustainability and responsibility programs outperform their peers financially. Okay, so there's no problem with that. She was just describing a study. But here is the problem. That is the premise of a new report, and it is an accurate one, judging by many conversations with those interested in better business, better corporate governance, and a sustainable future. So how does the journalist judge whether it is accurate? She doesn't look at the scientific rigor. She doesn't look, is it published in a top academic journal? She asks people who are already interested in sustainability, do you think that it is true? And they will obviously say yes, because they want it to be true. So if I am to tell you something, it has to be based on more than just wishful thinking. And so this is how I got into purpose myself a long time ago. Is I didn't want to be a purpose person. I just wanted to look at what drives long-term value. But it was the evidence that drove me to purpose as being a potential way in. So the big question is, well, how do we measure purpose? You can't just look at a company's statement, because companies can say some nice things and not put them into practice. So you might think, well, can we look at whether companies put their money where their mouth is? How much do they spend on corporate social responsibility? But that's not a great measure, because it could be that you spend a lot of money by giving a lot of money to charity, but you don't give to the right charities. So instead of looking at how much you spend, I wanted to look at how much value you deliver. I wanted to look at the output. And so what I looked at was the list of the 100 best companies to work for in America, which are companies that go above and beyond in how they treat their employees. Not how much you spend, but how satisfied and how engaged employees are. So why do I use employees as my measure of purpose? You might think, well, why don't I look at climate? Because climate change is the big threat. Now, climate change is a big threat, but climate change matters more in some sectors than others. It doesn't matter so much in tech, for example, whereas employees, they are key in nearly every industry that we think about. And what I found, long story short, was that 100 best companies to work for in America delivered shareholder returns that beat their peers by 2.3 to 3.8% per year over a 28-year period, which is 89 to 184% compounded. So simply put, companies that treat their workers well, they're not just being ethical and charitable and fluffy or even woke, they're being commercially sensible, they're investing in their most important asset, the pie grows and shareholders benefit in the long term. So let me give you an example with an Italian company. So I'm sure you'll all know the Italian luxury fashion brand, Brunello Cucinelli. And so they have a quite radical approach to how they think about their employees. So their employees work from 8 a.m. to 5:30 p.m. And after 5:30 p.m., they're forbidden from doing any more work. They can't stay in the office. They can't send any emails from their home. And even if they are in the office, no email can be sent to more than 2 people. So this saves your inboxes. How much time do you spend wading through your email rather than actually doing work? And also it ensures that emails only go to those who absolutely need to receive them. So my first job was at Morgan Stanley as a junior investment banker. And anytime a managing director would forward an email asking for thoughts, you would always want to respond because you wanted to reply to the managing director. And so even if he or she sent this to 15 different people, we would all waste our time trying to respond. But Brunello Cucinelli said, no, we don't want. And so what did Brunello himself say? He said, I believe in profits, yet I would also love it if earnings were achieved while respecting ethical and moral dignity. And what this evidence suggests is that's not just wishful thinking, that is something backed up by the data. Now, I said you should be skeptical. And you might think, well, is this correlation or is this causation? Because I seem to be telling you that if you treat your workers well, that will cause higher financial performance. But maybe it's the opposite. Maybe once the company is already doing really well, then it can afford to spend money on its employees. Or maybe there are common factors that affect both. If you're in the tech industry, employees are happy because it's a more fun job than doing coal mining. And also, if you're in the tech industry, that industry has performed well because that industry is outperforming the coal mining industry. So I have to do a lot of tests to rule out those alternative explanations and to suggest that this is the most likely channel. That is all described in chapter 4 of the book. So let me spend my remaining time before I get to Q&A on how to put this into practice. So my first part was about thinking about purpose as actively doing good, not just doing no harm. My second part was there is evidence that this suggests it is good for profits. But the third is the most tricky thing. Well, how do we actually become a purposeful company? So let's revisit what it means to be a purposeful company. So often companies think, well, to be purposeful, it involves having a statement like this. Our purpose is to serve customers, workers, suppliers, the environment, and communities and investors. Now that sounds great, but it's unrealistic because there might be trade-offs, right? We can't serve everybody. If you're an energy company and you shut down a polluting plant, that is good for the environment, but it's bad for workers. But if you think about the word purpose in the English language, it does not mean altruism. It does not mean pleasing everybody. It means being focused and targeted. For example, if you do something on purpose, you do it deliberately. And if I have a purposeful meeting, that is one with a clear agenda. So I view purpose as why a company exists, who it serves, its reason for being, and the role that it plays in the world. And this might seem a bit lofty and idealistic, so let me pick it apart. Why you exist, who you serve, your reason for being, and the role that you play, they all need to be specific. Your purpose cannot be to solve all 17 sustainable development goals. Those goals are goals for countries, for nations. It could be that Italy achieves all 17 goals, but maybe your company only focuses on 3 or 4. So the whole idea of purpose is to think about who you serve, the reason for being, the role that you play, and that needs to be specific and targeted. So how do you decide on what things to focus on? So if you only remember one thing from my talk, let it be this question. So ask yourself, what is in my hand? By this, I mean, what are the resources? What is the expertise that my company has? And how do we use these resources and this expertise to serve society if we think a little bit more creatively? So Marco and I will know this as economists as the idea of comparative advantage. So as a company, your goal is not to solve all of the world's problems, but to address these specific issues that you have unique comparative advantage to solve. So if I go back to Vodafone and M-Pesa, so Vodafone already had in their hand a technology. That technology used to be able to send text messages, and they thought, well, let's repurpose this instead to send mobile money. And notice that that is quite different to how many other companies think about purpose and sustainability. Rather than looking internally at what am I good at, what is in my hand, they look externally and they say, well, what is in the media? Because if I can latch onto what's in the media, then I can improve my public relations. For example, when George Floyd was murdered, many companies started donating to Black Lives Matter. Now, clearly, as an ethnic minority myself, I care about racial justice. But if you are Vodafone, do you really have comparative advantage in knowing which are the best charities? Is it Black Lives Matter? Or is it the Red Cross? Or is it Doctors Without Borders? That is not your expertise. So rather than looking at what can I get the most credit for, let me look internally and think about where is my comparative advantage. And the power of comparative advantage is that you can use this, even if money is tight, like a pandemic. So often people view responsibility as giving away part of the pie to others, sacrificing profits, giving money to charity. But that is just not feasible in a downturn, in a crisis, when you don't have pie to give. But if you're using the comparative advantage that you already have, that is something that shouldn't cost you much. For example, let's go back to some Italian examples. So the Italian fashion brand Prada, they don't have anything clearly relevant in a crisis, right? They make designer blazers and blouses. That doesn't help you in a pandemic. But if I think what is in their hand more generally, that is expertise in manufacturing clothing. And so use this to make 80,000 medical overalls and 110,000 face masks within 2 weeks. Let's think about another company, Isanova. That's a 3D printing company based in Brescia. And so that invented a valve that could transform a snorkeling mask into a ventilator. And then it shared its design online to be used by 60 other countries. So again, its expertise was 3D printing. How can they use that expertise in the pandemic? And finally, Bulgari. That's a luxury perfume company. And perfume is not really useful in a pandemic when people are staying at home. But what's in their hand was the ability to make alcohol-based products, and they repurposed this to make some hand sanitizer. So that's one thing that you can do to use what's in your hand, to use your current expertise, to do something different, to do something new by thinking a bit more creatively. But another thing that you can do is to use what's in your hand to do the same thing, but to do it in a different way. And so why do I think this is important? Yes, we often think about purpose as being about innovation. And maybe the examples I've just given you were inspiring, but they might also seem unrealistic because they are things that you might do once every 5 years. Launching M-Pesa, that is great. Making sanitizer rather than perfume, that is great, but you're not going to do this every day. So if purpose is something that only applies once every 5 years, then how does it affect your daily decisions? But it can also lead to you making everyday decisions in a different way. So let me go to some more sober and mundane examples. So Walker's Crisps, they make crisps. That is not an amazing company. It does not cure cancer. But in 2007, it wanted to reduce their carbon footprint. Now, in 2007, nobody cared about carbon footprint, so it wasn't doing this because it had to. It just thought it was the right thing to do. And so it partnered with the Carbon Trust, a charity, to figure out what is the carbon footprint of a packet of crisps from planting a potato tuber to throwing away a crisp. And so it figured out that the biggest source of carbon emissions was drying the potato. Why? Because it bought potatoes by gross weight, which is with the water in them. And so this gave farmers the incentive to keep the potatoes humidified to increase their weight. And then Walker's Crisps had to spend a lot of money drying the potatoes. So it chose to shift towards buying by dry weight, saved a lot of carbon emissions, but also saved a lot of energy and a lot of money. And why I think this is a great example is that lots of companies want to save money. They think about all the ways they can save money. Let's reduce headcount, let's hire McKinsey, but nobody would ever think about something like changing how they buy their potatoes. So this is why the desire to help society can ultimately lead to some cost savings. And we can think about this in terms of any other way to reduce our environmental footprint, reducing business travel. That is something that saves money. If I'm a cement company and I'm using waste lime water, not fresh limestone, because it's circular, that is something which saves money. And finally, the pharmaceuticals industry, historically, they always had to test their new products on animals. That seemed to be a given. But that leads to a lot of suffering, not just for the animals, but also for the scientists who test on the animals, see the animals suffer, and then see the animals get destroyed afterwards. And often you want to become a scientist to develop some things to help people, not to cause suffering. So there were pharmaceuticals companies that chose to develop alternatives, computer testing or testing with chemical testing instead. And not only does that save pain and suffering, but it also saves money, because to buy a rhesus monkey costs $50,000. Now you might think, well, any company would want to save money by developing alternatives, but often these pharmaceutical companies thought there's no way we can get around animal testing because this is just something we need to do. But the purpose, the desire to end pain and suffering, that, when combined with a financial incentive, that allowed some companies to go above and beyond what their competitors were doing. Okay, so let me stop there and open it up to questions and answers. But let's just highlight, well, why did I write this book? Because I think for far too long, people have thought about responsibility as being a nice to have, good for society, good for the planet, maybe good for public relations, but really isn't fundamental to a business. A business should be about making money and focusing on profits. But what I'm trying to highlight is actually, even if your only goal is profits, actually purpose can be a way of achieving this. This is not just based on wishful thinking, but some rigorous evidence. But note, this is not an academic book. It is backed up by evidence, but it's written entirely for practitioners, and it has practical frameworks and case studies to put this into practice. Really proud that now this is published in Italian, and really grateful for the University of Padova to give me the opportunity to share these insights. So let me pause here and let me hand over to Marco to do the Q&A.
So thanks, Alex, for this very clear and insightful presentation. For the audience, the Q&A button is open. So if you want to post the Q&A, please do it using the function. Let me first ask you a question while we wait for some questions from the audience. In your book, you spend some words about shareholders' activism. So how can shareholders' activism foster this transition to reconciling purpose and profit, in your view?
Well, that's a great question, Mark. I know that every speaker says that's a great question when they're asked a question, but this is truly a great question, because actually my views on this have changed a little bit from when I wrote the book. So I wrote the book in 2020 initially, and I thought, well, shareholder activism is always good, because shareholders, they come in and they will advise a company, oh, you should invest more in reducing your carbon footprint, in improving your workforce diversity, in trying to serve society a bit more. And why is that useful? Because sometimes as a company, you get so focused on the day-to-day that you sometimes forget about these wider, more long-term issues. So just a bit like companies hire management consultants and they hire investment bankers. Well, these are people who charge money for their services. Often as a shareholder, you're willing to provide that advice for free because you have a stake in the company. So the book is very pro shareholder engagement and suggests that shareholders should be involved to try to advise a company on how they can do things better. Now, why my views have changed a little bit, they've not done a complete 180, but why my views have become a bit more nuanced in the last few years is that we see some engagement which borders on micromanagement. So sometimes as a shareholder, your goal is not actually to try to create value and improve how the company does, but to show off to everybody how much I'm engaging. So if you're a shareholder who writes in the media and says, hey, we're going to force every company to hire 50% of women, then you're probably going to get some people who will think, well, this is a great shareholder, I'm going to invest my money with you because it's going to promote gender equality. But this is sometimes problematic, because often companies do take gender equality into account anyway. They know that that's important, but it's not the only factor. There's other aspects of diversity. There's ethnic diversity, but more importantly, there's cognitive diversity. A white male can add a lot of diversity to an organization if they have a different background. And sometimes to micromanage a company and to say, well, this is how much carbon you should emit, this is who you should be hiring, that can sometimes do more harm than good. So one thing I'm now suggesting to shareholders is to ask yourself, if you could not tell anybody you were engaging, would you still be engaging? And I think this is important because often shareholders engage to get publicity rather than to actually create value. So what I want to do is to highlight that there should be boundaries to engagement. More engagement is not always better. Sometimes this could lead to micromanagement.
Okay, thanks. We have a couple of questions from faculty members here. The first one is from Anna Alexander. She's professor of accounting in our department. And she asks, how can companies find the incentives to switch and start thinking about the purpose as well? What would be your suggestion to foster this switch?
Thanks, Anna, for the question. And I think the answer is actually we can't really force companies to do something, but instead to highlight how it's in their own interest. And this is why my approach differs from many other approaches. So other approaches is let's regulate it. Let's regulate and force a company to be purposeful. But regulation can often lead to hitting the target and missing the point. So again, you could force a company to have 40% of females on the board of directors, which is what they've done in Norway. But this might lead to all of the females that you put on being ones from very wealthy backgrounds. They could be all ex-investment bankers, rather than ones which are diverse in many other aspects. You can focus a lot on diversity because you can measure it, but not equity and inclusion because that's more difficult to measure. So unlike other approaches, which is to try to force companies, and I think this can lead to just compliance, not commitment, what I'm trying to do is to highlight it's in your own interest as a company to treat your stakeholders well. So my work on being a great place to work suggests that if you create a diverse and inclusive environment and culture, your company can do better in the long term. It's a bit like some approaches that governments have to health. So in the UK, at least, we don't force people to eat the fruit and vegetables, but instead we say there's a lot of evidence suggesting that actually 5 portions of fruit and vegetables a day, that leads to good health. It has all of these benefits. It provides all of these vitamins. And so that is what I try to do instead through my research, suggesting that these are things which are in your interest to adopt, even if you're not forced. Now, that's not to say that we shouldn't have any regulation. And certainly in chapter 10 of the book, I'll highlight the role for regulations to internalize externalities, things like having a carbon tax. But other things, there's a limit to what you can achieve by forcing, because otherwise people will just comply with the letter of the law, even if they don't fully embrace its spirit.
Okay, thanks. Let me go to the next question. That's from another professor of ours, 𝐁𝐵𝐻𝐸 Boesso. He is asking, according to your framework, could there be a role of foundations, corporate foundations, to help in the transition?
Thanks, 𝐁𝐵𝐻𝐸, for the question. And this is, again, another topic where I have a quite different view to what people typically think. So there are some views. Let's change corporate foundations. So let's change the corporate charter to say the goal of the company is not shareholder value, but it's wider society, a stakeholder value in general. And so there are what's known as public benefit corporations, which have a more general purpose, saying our goal is to act in society's interest. But the problem with that is it's extremely vague, right? So it's really difficult to know, are you acting in society's interests, right? But why? Because if I am to shut down a polluting plant, it's bad for workers, but it's good for the environment. But it's hard to say, is that good overall for wider society? Almost any decision that you take will harm somebody in wider society. For example, if I'm a really good company and I drive my competitors out of business because I am just really good, well, that's something which harms wider society. So I think it's quite vague to say we want to just have a goal of helping wider society. So, and really, is that the barrier? Is when CEOs think about what am I trying to do, are they always constrained by the corporate charter? No, what constrains them is the idea that I don't think it's going to be improving profits in the long term. So this is why I think the approach of saying this is in your own interest, rather than changing the corporate charter, that is probably the more effective approach.
Okay. So There is another question from our professor. It says, your approach framework, Francesco Favotto, your approach framework seems to close to the benefit companies. Do you have any view about these benefit companies? Do you think they are good for the purpose or else?
Yeah, thank you, Francesco. And again, my concern with benefit corporations is it's very vague. So benefit corporations says, well, let's define our public benefit as being something beyond shareholder value. So one example is Lemonade, which is an insurance company in the US. And they say our goal is to be the world's most loved lemonade company. But what does it mean to be the most loved insurance company? So what does it mean to be the most loved insurance company? Who is it going to be loved by? Is it loved by its shareholders? Is it loved by its employees? Is it loved by its customers? Now, you could be loved by your customers if you paid out on every single insurance claim, but that's not good for your shareholders. You could be loved by your competitors. Why? Because you're not an effective company. So it's not clear who you're loved by. And what does it mean to be most loved? Are you loved for your profitability? Are you loved for your innovation? Are you loved for sponsoring sports games and football teams? Are you loved for contributions to your local community? So these things I think are really, really vague. And this is not just my view. There is a great paper. Let me try to bring this up. It's called The Value of a Public Benefit Corporation. Yeah, and so this is importantly, it's written by some lawyers, some legal scholars who obviously know much more about this topic than me. And they're saying, well, is there actually any legal force behind this? Because they're saying, well, let's change the legal foundations, which is something that 𝐂𝐨𝐻𝐿 was asking about, in order to legally force or encourage companies to think about purpose. But what they're saying is that this really has no legal founding behind this. Why? Because legally, it's really difficult to say, have you achieved your public benefit? Because public benefits are often in rather vague terms. So for me, rather than legally trying to compel companies to do this, let's say, well, this is something which is in your own interest.
Okay, so I know we are very strict on time, so let me close with a final question, this webinar. So your book was published 4 years ago. So what have you seen changing the most after 4 years? So this is an environment in which companies are moving very fast, especially in the West. Have you seen progresses or are we doing bad? What's your view on this? So how did you see things changing?
Yeah, so what I see is double-edged. On the one hand, there's now a lot of great excitement about purpose and responsibility and a view that, yes, this needs to be central. So why I wrote the book was people were ignoring purpose. And now I don't think it's being ignored. People are realizing it's important. But then I think it's gone too far to the other extreme, is now sometimes people think about purpose and responsibility as the most important thing. So when a new director gets appointed to a board, the first thing people look at is this person a woman or an ethnic minority? So they don't actually look at, does this person actually have any credentials? So sometimes actually ESG has so much focus that it drowns out regular important stuff. So more recently, I wrote this paper called The End of ESG. So it's in an academic journal, Financial Management, but it was written almost exclusively for practitioners. There is not a single equation or table in this paper, but this highlights how ESG, it's important, but it should not be put on a pedestal compared to other factors. So why I call it the end of ESG is I'm not an anti-ESG person. I'm saying ESG is extremely important. It should not be called ESG because that suggests that it's niche. But also the problem with calling it ESG is that things with ESG in their title have a special halo on them. People think that this is even more important than other factors, but sometimes we actually need to not be too extreme in the other end. 5 years ago, people said ESG was irrelevant. Now people say it's the most important thing. And I'm saying it is as important as other things like management quality, corporate culture and innovative capability, but it shouldn't be put on a pedestal compared to the rest of them.
Oh, we got just 2 final questions because I think they are very interesting. So let me just read them to you. One is from Fabio Buttignon, and he asks, okay, and what if the pie is shrinking? Even if you are a good purpose-oriented company, how do you manage a situation when the pie shrinks? And the very last one from Alessandro Tognazzi is, can you extend your argument to a global scale, considering how different are local culture and dynamics and social conditions?
Yeah, so I think these, again, are two really good questions. So I think the importance of, let's go to the second one, about the importance of having local context. This is really important. And because often the problem with purpose is that there are people, often in the West, who are trying to impose their values on everybody else, not realizing that different countries have different goals. So I'm part of the World Economic Forum Global Future Council for Responsible Investing, and we had a discussion on the net zero transition. And then one woman from Africa, she stood up and she said, you talk about a transition, a just transition, but 600 million people in Africa have no electricity. We have nothing to transition from. So we need to be careful about imposing sort of our own particular views as to what is responsible on other countries at different stages of economic development. And then the question about what happens when the pie shrinks, it's important to make sure that everybody feels the pain. So what I will talk about in the book is how in the pandemic, rather than just the workers being made redundant, there were many companies where executives took a big hit. Some of them went without salary for a while to make sure that the pain was shared. So when the pie shrinks, if we are all having a part of the pie, all of our slices must shrink. It's not that this should be disproportionately borne by just the junior employees.
Okay. With that, let me thank you again for being here with us at the University of Padua today. It's been a great pleasure. Thanks for your time, and thanks also for the audience for attending this webinar at lunchtime. So good luck with your book in Italy, and we will be happy to host you in Padua anytime. Thanks again. And thanks
Thank you so much, Marco.
Bye.
Thank you so much, everybody, for your engagement. Take care.
Bye-bye.